Well, hey, friends, welcome to Awakening's Ask a Scholar podcast. This is where you, the everyday Christian, can get your questions about the Bible answered by a biblical scholar. I'm Carla.
And I'm Mike, and we're both glad that you decided to join our discussion. So let's dive in.
Well, welcome everyone to episode 27 of our podcast. And we are really excited to get your questions on the book of Job answered today. I know this is a book of the Bible that stirs up a lot of thought, a lot of question, a lot of discussion. And so we're excited today to have Dr. Dominick Hernández join us for this conversation. Dr. Hernández, welcome. Thank you for being a part of it.
Thank you, Carla, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be on.
Awesome. Well, why don't you start maybe by just telling our audience a little bit about yourself, your areas of study, some of the work you focused on in the past so that they can get to know you a little bit, and then we'll start to dive into those questions.
Sure. As you said, my name is Dominick Hernández, and originally from the northeast of the United States, New York-born Puerto Rican. Um, eventually studied kinesiology. So I was a health and physical education teacher and even did a master's degree in that. But then while I was going to a church that taught expositionally through the scriptures, I thought to myself, I'd love to be able to learn how to teach a Bible study. And so I ended up at a school of ministry. From New York City, I moved to Southern California to go to a school of ministry. And at that school of ministry, I thought, oh, I need to learn a little bit more about biblical languages and ancient Near Eastern and Greco-Roman backgrounds and things like that. So I probably need to go to a formal place that has the resources to be able to help out with that. And so I ended up at Princeton Theological Seminary. And from there, after realizing that I wanted to focus in Old Testament, eventually moved to Israel and did my PhD at Bar Ilan University under the tutelage of Professor Ed Greenstein, focusing on the issue of the prosperity of the wicked in the book of Job and other ancient Near Eastern literature, a comparative work that eventually came out as a monograph called The Prosperity of the Wicked, a theological problem in the in Job and in the ancient Near East. That's a little bit about my academic background. I'm currently associate professor of Old Testament and Semitics at Talbot School of Theology, Biola University here in Los Angeles. La Mirada more specifically. Here I also direct the Spanish language program called Talbot en Español. We offer 3 master's degrees, completely online, completely in Spanish. So a couple of languages, couple of continents, a little bit of my background.
Wow, that's awesome. We are at Awakening. We're just now getting ready to translate some of our courses into Spanish and Portuguese. So we're excited
Neat.
to start offering content in those languages. So it's awesome to hear all of your experience. Okay, great. Well, then let's dive into our questions. We've got some good questions, and I think it's going to spark some good conversation between you and Mike. So I'm going to kick us off with our first one, which simply says, can the book of Job be considered fiction? I know this is a question that has stirred a lot of debate and talk. So why don't you guys dive into that question?
Well, you can consider anything fiction. That's the first answer. Like, yes. Right? Anything can be
Yeah.
fiction. Any part of the Bible could be fiction. So the question is whether, the question is not whether or not you can consider something fiction, because the answer to that is just clearly yes. The answer, or maybe the question, needs to revolve a little bit more around whether or not we should consider Job fiction. That might
Mm-hmm.
be a better way to approach it, in my opinion. Maybe I'm not understanding the question properly, and that needs to even be nuanced some more. So, what do you mean by fiction? Do you mean a script of exactly what happened in its entirety? Is that the only thing that's not considered fiction? Um, right, like a comprehensive historical account, or do you just mean maybe that is Job a real historical person?
Mm-hmm.
Those are different questions. They're on different sides of the spectrum as it relates to history and fiction. So I'll just say a couple of things with regard to the person Job. Um, it is true throughout history that some may have not considered him a historical figure. And there are reasons for that. I think probably some of the best reasons that come from the book is that the prologue, so the first 2 chapters, seem to use round numbers or sort of kind of ideal numbers. Not many specific details are given It looks sort of like we're at some points are getting like a once upon a time type of story. And
Mhm.
then, and probably one of the more convincing things, at least to me, uh, maybe one of the best points on this side is Job then talks to his friends in like straight up high level poetry. You know what I mean? Like biblical Hebrew poetry, and
Yeah.
you're like, whoa. Um, Now, that's not a comprehensive list of things, but, you can sort of understand why people would say, "Ah, maybe this is sort of like a parable or a story with some points that, an ancient Israelite writer wanted to make." Um, Even that doesn't preclude the idea of Job being a historical person. So it seems like also on the other side of things that the book can be read as speaking of a historical person, using round numbers to talk about the things that he had, like the amount of cattle that he had, not portraying a comprehensive account of his life. Sometimes we expect more of what we would consider history than we actually get. And actually speaking of, broadly speaking, or giving the gist of a historical person talking to his friends. Now, by the way, before people say, well, giving the gist is basically still fiction, I would encourage people that believe in the New Testament to recognize that the Gospels essentially, in many ways, give the gist of Jesus's conversations with his disciples as well. And
Mhm.
many of us would consider these, at least the Gospels, not to be fiction. We would consider them to be historical insofar as we understand history properly. So in that sense, I would say, in summation, yes, you can understand anything to be fiction. Should we understand Job to be completely fiction? I think that the fact that he's mentioned in Ezekiel twice and also in James, as well as maybe if we shift a little bit what we consider to be historical or history, and we talk about the historical person as opposed to sort of a word by word, expecting a word by word transcript of his conversations with his friends. I would say that we should not consider this fiction like we might
Mhm.
understand novels in our day and age.
Mm.
Yeah, I was thinking, I mean, there's a little bit of kind of this underlying assumption that somehow the our present day standards of history taking or history like recording has to be applied to the Book of Job, and I would agree. I agree with what you mean about it, anything can be fiction, and at the same time, I also agree that in many ways, I think there was also a historical person, but that does not mean that what we have in the Book of Job is meant to be a historical 21st century version of history. I I I notice how highly stylized the first two chapters are as well, and even when I was reading through some other research, I was intrigued by the idea that Samuel Ballantyne years ago had suggested, which was that the Book of Job that Job is being presented as though he's like a second Adam. That there's this almost this question that seems to be implicit of what if Adam and his wife did not disobey God? What if they got to live in an idyllic world? And the question would then be, can pain and suffering still enter that world? And I've always been fascinated since reading that thought that the narrator is not necessarily thinking, I'm presenting you a 21st century historical account. He's presenting a man that seems to have been commonly known, maybe not by the name Job, but by the idea of a pious worshiper of God who endures great suffering. And the Bible's version of that takes on, yes, the name Job, but it's presenting something that's very relatable to anyone from any time frame of why do good people suffer? Why do bad things happen to good people? And it's starting from something that's very relatable. And so while it can be fiction, I guess from that sense, it doesn't mean that there was not a basis of historical fact or a basis of a person that had existed in a long time memory. I don't know. As you were talking, I was thinking of there's one of these final scenes from this HBO show called John Adams. It was based on John Adams' life. And he went through the whole entire Revolutionary War. And near the end of his life, he gets presented with a painting of when the Constitution was being written. And he's an old crudgety man at this point, and he starts criticizing the painter's work of how it's not historically accurate, that it doesn't capture the heat of the summer when they were meeting for the constitutional meeting. It doesn't capture the smell, the stench, the annoyance, the discomfort they all felt in crafting this. It's like an idealized version of it. But at the same time, it is also a historical presentation of the moment when the Constitution was written. And so I feel that tension sometimes when I see questions like this about the Book of Job. At least those are my thoughts.
Neat illustration. Appreciate the illustration.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's
we
great.
could continue on this. We could continue nuancing what fiction is, and we can continue nuancing what history is, and we can continue to talk about whether or not there's anything historical in the Book of Job and to what level we would consider historicity and fiction and all of
Mhm.
those things. But ultimately, I think that when I get these types of questions, they generally are asking, was there a person named Job, and did he have friends, and
Mhm.
did they have conversations like that? That's what I think people tend to be getting at. And I would say there's always a chance that this stuff is completely made up. In Job's case, I'm not I would tend to think that it is not completely, like, made up. There's just these guys. But I know of some people, and some people that I read, that believe differently. And yeah, it's difficult to sort of demonstratively, like, to demonstrate definitively either way.
Mhm. Yeah,
Mhm.
but regardless, it's in the Bible and it's there for a reason, and we should still pay attention to it, correct?
Oh, I would say even more than what you just said. I would say yay to what you just said, but I would also say that it it's not that we just pay attention to it because it's in the Bible. It seems that there were communities way before us that thought that this was a very important composition
Mhm.
that somehow, some way revealed something unique about the character of God as they coupled it together with other
Mm,
documents that also revealed something unique about the character of God. So, like,
mm,
yeah, I would say we're in the downline, we're in the downstream of other people that were God-fearers and that honored God, that strive to honor this God of Israel, that realized there was something unique about the people of Israel and the God of Israel,
mhm,
and wanted to uh, and believe that through this document they could perceive something about that God that may have been different than the other ancient Near Eastern gods in the environment in which the ancient Israelites existed. So, yay to what you said, but I would maybe even make it a
even
little bit
more.
stronger. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. Awesome. Okay, let's jump to a second question. And this question says, God allows Satan to call the shots throughout this book. Does that mean that the Lord is still allowing Satan to call the shots now until the Lord returns?
So, a couple of things. Let's rephrase the question, because if you remember, it's actually God that's like, yeah, but you can't
Right.
you can't touch him, right? And then
Mhm.
you can't kill him. Like, I give you permission to touch him, basically. But and then
Mm-hmm.
also, Satan's complaint the first time around is like, he's like that because you set your hedge around him. So it doesn't sound like this is the premise for the question is kind of a little bit jacked up, in my opinion. Like, this is not
Hmm.
it's just not true. It's That's not how I think the prologue is presented. But I do think, and this is where I would sympathize with, I think, what, the person that's answering this question, is that it's weird for, like, it seems like God and Satan to enter into some sort of like agreement or something like that, where, like,
Mm-hmm.
Satan seems to influence what's going on in the divine council. And some of the explanation of that has to do with, like, who this Satan character is. Is this the actual Satan that we see eventually showing up in Zechariah and Chronicles, like the personal sort of entity that represents evil that we see in the New Testament to be the enemy of all Christian people? Or is this some other Satan, some accuser or slanderer or something like that, that could potentially be, functioning within the divine council under this sovereign God that is being depicted as portrayed as the actual God in this divine council or something like this. Not the best explanation, but hopefully the listeners will understand. What I'm getting at is some of what we read in the prologue is best understood, I think, viewed through a lens as to how we perceive this Satan character, or what we eventually end up believing who the Satan character is. So for those that believe that this ends up being like the actual Satan that we see referred to in the New Testament and in later biblical books, yeah, that ends up being like, whoa, hey, what's this embodiment of evil doing hanging out in the divine council? And I get that, but it's not calling the shots. Like, let's call a dime. He's not calling the shots. He's not. I don't read those chapters that way. But the other option is and there are several sort of sub options here. But if this Satan character is somehow, some way functioning within the divine council, this Satan has a role. This is the accuser. This is maybe the entity that does these types of things. Still's not calling the shots, but it's a little bit less. You
Mhm.
ready? Weird. It's a little less
Yeah.
weird for people that may hold to sort of a traditional view of there being a personal Satan that's the enemy of of believers.
Dominic, I think also I've noticed people don't seem to remember that it's actually not this accuser who brings up Job at the beginning of the book.
Yeah.
It's actually
Have you seen
Yahweh,
my?
right?
Have you paid attention to my
Yeah.
servant Job? Hasamta libcha lavdi Yov. That's exactly what it says. Have you paid attention to my servant Job?
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah. This
it's
is God
Yahweh who
speaking.
brings him up. So it is just a funny thing of like that. It's not so much of like, I agree. It's not the Satan or the accuser that's calling these shots. What I do think though is interesting is that even when Yahweh does give this accuser, this entity, the power to influence Job's life or to affect his life, this character still has, in some sense, like volition on how badly he could turn this up on Job. And I do understand and I do sympathize with folks who think that it might be the personal personification of evil that we think of typically, of like this the Satan, the one that confronted Jesus in the wilderness. I get that. At the same time, it's like he does seem to be playing a role. He's not the one that brings up Job in the first place. He's in response to Yahweh bringing Job up in this dialogue. But at the end of the day, I do think this accuser does also have the volition on how badly he was turning on the pressure on Job. He didn't necessarily have to kill all the servants. He didn't have to destroy all of Job's possessions. He didn't have to kill all of Job's children, let alone even kill any of them. He could have just turned on the pressure. But instead, he does take them out, and that I cannot explain why. But yeah, it is. I don't think the Satan was calling the shots at all. I think, ironically, if anything, Yahweh was actually just happy about Job, and then just this conversation gets started between Yahweh and the accuser.
So let me push you guys a little further, because if I put myself in the shoes of the person that asked this question. I don't know exactly what they were thinking, but when I read it, it does make me wonder if they are asking, regardless of if Satan called the shots, which we clearly know that he did not call the shots, like you guys pointed out. I wonder if they're asking, does this still happen today? Is there this divine council going on right now where God is bringing up certain of us and saying, oh, they're doing a great job, whatever it is. And then this accuser is saying, oh, well, can I attack in this way? Oh, well, can I have free reign in this way? And then that is the cause of what's happening in our own lives that are bad, sick, horrible, whatever the things are until the Lord returns. It makes me wonder if that is more of their question. So I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts around that.
I'm going to give like a super scholarly response that I hope is understandable to your
Sure.
listeners. Who knows? Like, who knows? No. I it sounds crazy, right? But like, one of the things that I think Job does is a composition, and this is this gets a little bit more into hermeneutics and like how we read Job and how we're supposed to read this composition. One of the things that it does as a composition is it's unique in the Bible, not the only instance, but it's unique as a book, and that it begins by providing readers, exclusively readers, insight into this divine counsel. Now, the
Mhm.
reason why that's important in the context of this question, the context of answering this question, is because we don't get that lots. We don't get that a lot in the Bible. We don't know like what happens in these divine council meetings and how frequently they happen. Now, I'm speaking a little bit tongue in cheek here, obviously, but we have this one instance in which readers, by way of the narrator, who's like the plenipotentiary for God here, we're given insight into what's going on like in heaven. And that's how the book starts off, and that's how readers are supposed to read the entirety of the book, taking into
Mhm.
consideration what we see in the prologue. So when we read this stuff in the prologue, I'm not so sure that a proper reading of the prologue is to think, wait, hold on a sec, like when does this happen? How frequently does this happen? Have I ever been brought up? That's not really, in my opinion, the goal of the prologue in this composition. The goal is for us to hear Job cursing the day of his birth and go, whoa, 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 Job, calm down. Like, you're not the one at fault here. In fact, you're not at fault for anything. And then when we start to read Job's friends, be like, look, your kids died. That's because
Mm.
you're wicked, right? We're supposed to go, ooh, they have no idea what they're talking about. And
Yep.
as the conversation continues, we're supposed to start to make judgments on what the characters that are saying based upon our privileged knowledge. I think that's why the prologue is there. And I'm not so sure what that means in terms of some sort of celestial events that happen prior to that, or celestial events that continue to happen into the present day that far transcend any dimension that we are privy to.
I mean, I think it does reveal a little bit more of it actually probably speaks more of our culture's tendency, right? To look at something like this and it's like make this individualized and personable. It's like, oh, this could affect me. And totally lose out on the fact. Like when I realized what Bildad had said to Job years ago when I was studying the book, my jaw dropped. Because I'm the feeling I got was you're actually supposed to be enthralled with the story, and also you're supposed to have almost this feeling of being an audience member watching a rap battle, and just reacting to the words that are being said to one another. And when Bildad said that to Job about his children, the thing that instantly runs in my mind is, how could you be called a friend? Friends don't say that to one another. Like that's the reaction, and not necessarily to, oh, is this going to happen to me? I do think it is more of a modern a more of our modernist concerns. We tend to try to apply everything in almost a very literalistic, personalized way of the scriptures all the time to us, because somehow we're convinced that's the only way that the Bible can mean anything to us, I feel. but it's sort of missing out on just the wisdom and just the reactions we're supposed to have from reading this back and forth that's happening between Job and his friends. Um, like I still just couldn't get over the fact that Bildad said what he did to Job, and that Job did not outrightly just slap him, like, of all things, because
That's not good poetry, man.
who's yeah, who's I mean, just who says that kind of thing to a friend? And so that's like that's I think what we should be more taken back by, of like in some sense Job's restraint, um, but also just the audacity. It's like to be enthralled with the story and not so much of like, oh, does this happen up in heaven with me?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I think it is just our human nature to wonder, and point it back on our own personal lives whenever we read stories like that. But no, I thank you guys for those answers. And I think it's okay to say that nobody knows. There's some mysteries that we just won't know, and that's okay. And that's where we have to feel comfortable sitting with that and glean the things that we can and should glean from these books in the Bible. So okay, guys, let's jump to a quick commercial break, and we're going to come back and hit a couple more questions and then wrap up this episode. If you're not already reading with us, we'd love to have you start reading today. Every month in the Awakening Bible community, we read a book or several books of the Bible together. Readings are only 1 to 3 chapters a day, 5 days a week, with weekends reserved for catch-up or deeper study. And as you read, we know that you will likely encounter questions, but that's where we come in. Submit your questions at awkng.com, and we will do our best to get them answered for you right here on the Ask a Scholar podcast. Well, welcome back, everyone. Let's dive into our third question of today's podcast. And this question says, besides the beginning and the end of the book, Job doesn't appear to be a very righteous man, especially in his speeches about God. I've heard some teachers and pastors say Job came very close to cursing God. Is that what I'm seeing here? So I think, they really are focusing on that middle section. So talk to us about that middle section and our thoughts on if Job was righteous or not.
Yeah, this is a great question in my opinion. It's also very honest. That's not just filler, because frequently when we read difficult books of the Bible, if we read them sometimes, right? It's like when we read
Yeah.
difficult books of the Bible, if we read them, we focus on the few points that might be a little understandable to us, and then jump around the stuff that's a little bit difficult. And by the way, this is just us as human beings.
Mm.
But if we apply sort of this way of reading to the book of Job, what we understand is the following, and that is there was a really good guy named Job. He didn't do anything, but there was some really bad stuff that happened to him. And then, but he didn't curse God. And then we frequently skip to the epilogue. And we're like, but he got everything back. And most people, I think, interpret it like this: Job said sorry for all the bad things he said, and then he got everything back. Now,
Hmm.
if that's the
Mm.
case, if Job says sorry for all of the bad things that he said, then it seems like Satan wins, because Job did something and then got something. So I'm kind of like, I'm not so sure that I like that reading. And I wonder how many like children's Bibles have influenced that reading, to be completely honest with you. That's mostly a joke,
Mm.
but not completely a joke. So I think to myself, like let's actually examine some of these things that Job says. So if you look at Job chapter 9, verses 20 to 24, Job says some really direct, and I guess you could say even harsh things there. He says, judgment is all one. I think he's talking about judgment. He says God mocks the innocent, or basically, there are people that are suffering and God mocks that. And he says, it, that there is no difference between the judgment of the righteous and the wicked. It says some really harsh things. Maybe I would consider those 5 verses to maybe be the harshest words that Job says directly to God about God. And then you get to the end of the composition and you read something like he did not Eliphaz did not speak rightly about him, that is God, like my servant Job. And we're kind of like, holy smokes, what is this? Has to be added or something like that. This has to be like a nice scribal insertion to try to make this more orthodox or something, or to boost Job's confidence. We don't know. But I actually think that the harsh words that we get from Job are Job speaking from a position of integrity. So throughout
Mm.
the composition, even though his friends sound a lot like traditional wisdom, the traditional wisdom that we see in the Proverbs, for example, the traditional wisdom that we see in the Torah that essentially suggests in their interpretation that people receive, we could say maybe always receive the consequences for their actions, which is how some might read the Proverbs, sections of the Proverbs. Like that's sort of the traditional dogma of the friends. The more that we read that they apply this to Job's situation, given that we have information from the prologue, the more we realize that they're actually speaking wrongly about God. That's not how God functions.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Job is refusing to accept that. Now, by the way, that system of just retribution is almost, well, it seems exclusively based in traditional wisdom. It doesn't seem to take into consideration the human experience, which is what Job is almost exclusively taking into consideration, his experience. So Job rejects his friend's bad talk about God's system of just retribution for the most part, and looks to God and he says exactly what's going on in his life. Now, if you look at
Mm-hmm.
other books that are traditionally considered wisdom, like Kohelet, for example, Ecclesiastes, you read Kohelet sometimes and you're like, dude, what is Kohelet talking about? Nothing new under the sun. It's all cyclical. Like everybody's going to die. Like your death is like waiting for you, dude. And you're like, whoa. And these Job section and Kohelet, I would say, are very earthly and human books. They're just like us. So when stuff happens to us, sometimes we censor ourselves and
Mm-hmm.
our talk with God. And we don't say the types of things that Job says, even though we actually are wondering them. Like, holy smokes, God, I have honored you my whole life, and I have this sickness. And this dude that lives next door inherited all of his money, and he does
Mm-hmm.
nothing good with it to honor you. And in fact, this person I know puts a bunch of drugs in his body, and he's healthier than me. Like, is
Yeah.
there any system of just retribution ever? Job's friends were like, ah, no, Job, you're the guy that honors God, but there must be something hidden in your heart because it's how God functions. And Job was like, nope,
Mm.
and my problem's with you. I see Job speaking those harsh words from a position of integrity and not a
Mhm.
position of striving to manipulate God, like as if he were some divine gumball machine. You know, you put something in, you turn
Mhm.
the little knob, and you get something from God. That's how it's. Job refuses to accept that type of God, and as a result of that, speaks directly to God from that position of integrity and says some really, really direct things. But eventually, that speech is commended by God, and his friend's speech, even though it sounds more orthodox, is condemned.
Hmm. Wow. Well said.
Yeah. I mean, I think Job is just like he's been for me like a model of authenticity, right? Because I think, sometimes like in the modern evangelical experience, I have noticed that we've tried to alleviate our pain and everyone else's pain as quickly as possible. And, for some cases, sometimes it can help, it may work. But I haven't seen a model within modern evangelical expressions that takes into account what to do when one is going through chronic suffering, chronic pain, that there is not really an end date. There's no end game to it all. Like you just don't know how long, or maybe that perpetually you will be experiencing this hardship, this difficulty, this pain for the rest of your life. And we often try to gloss over that with, well, we trust God and God will take care of things in the end. And then we try to quickly shovel that away and not think too hard about it. But then we're also not walking alongside folks who are experiencing that reality, and that there are going to be those peaks and those valleys in that human experience, and we don't encourage folks to engage God authentically. And here I see with Job, he does. He is engaging with his creator. Rawly, maybe harshly for our ears, but he's doing it authentically before the creator. There's nothing to hide. There is nothing to hide. He has nothing left. And so all he has is just how he's feeling and his emotions. And so, yeah, I understand why it's so different from church world. But this is really from a human ground level experience. This is what I would expect from a person that's going through a kind of pain and suffering that does not necessarily have an end.
Hmm. Yeah. I want to push a little further with this last question, and I'm going to switch up some of our orders. I'm going to actually pull a question from the next episode we're going to record because I think it ties into this conversation. But you touched on that whole gumball approach, stick a coin in, see what you get back, right? And then also Job speaking from a place of integrity, where his friends were saying, "Oh, well, no, it's because you have a sin," or "Oh, no, it's because you did this," and one of the questions that came in for the next episode says, based on the themes and lessons in this book, should we consider that when we get sick, it is a test of our faith? Is this true that we are tested in this way because we aren't exhibiting our faith in God in the correct manner?
This question is complex. I want to give it a simple answer. It could be completely loaded with all types of theologies that suggest that sickness, personal sickness, is um, somehow, some way, indicative of some sort of personal sin or something like that. And if that's the case,
Mhm.
um, the broad answer to that is absolutely not. Like, we all get sick. Uh,
Right.
this is what happens. Sickness is not necessarily, notice the word necessarily, indicative of some sort of personal sin. Now, we all sin, we all get sick, but there doesn't seem to be a very clear one-to-one relation all of the time. It's like when I'm doing well, I'm staying healthy. Like, not that doesn't line up with human experience. So I would just say no. And there's all types of theologies down the same trajectory that sound very much like supposed traditional wisdom that you see in the Bible, and really what they are, in my opinion, are sort of taking adages from Proverbs and the Torah out of context and applying them in contexts in which they don't apply, which suggests that there's sort of a natural give and take in the cosmos. You do something good, you get something good. You do something bad, you get something bad. Okay, now here's the nuance here. Uh, Sometimes we do things that make us sick. You know what I mean? Like,
Mhm.
sometimes we we facilitate that sickness, and many times when we do that, it's because of what we would call sin, right? So think about over drinking alcohol, or it doesn't need to be alcohol, overeating, or any of these types of things that are like lack of self control. They can make us sick. So I want to make sure that we nuance this and say there are consequences to the things that we do, but at the same time, it doesn't seem that there's this one-to-one effect of
Right.
us doing something bad and immediately suffering or whether it be immediate or eventual, suffering the consequences of that in like our physical state. It's important to note also that well, maybe I should pause there. That doesn't seem to be the case biblically, and it doesn't seem to line up with our human experience, but it is taught frequently by certain types of churches or congregations that really want to encourage their congregations to give. Because
Hmm.
sometimes in
Yeah.
those types of environments, blessing the church or blessing God can be tangibly viewed by making some sort of financial offering or sacrificing even one's time to serve in some sort of, again, tangible way. And so
Hmm.
those types of theologies can creep in. They're not just, it's not like everybody's, wanting to, but they can really creep in when there's an emphasis on whether it be, that type of church, or even when there's emphasis in in churches that aren't those types of churches that teach that type of theology overtly when there's a building project. Or when like
Mm-hmm.
that type of theology can sort of slowly slip into what we end up at least signaling. So
Yeah.
it's not like I'm saying, oh, these are just heretics that teach this stuff. You know, there's some of that, I think, but I also think that that we can default to signaling that we actually believe that there are issues with people um, when there's something wrong with them. By the way, I'm sorry. I know I probably should stop talking, but I just want to say one thing. To make this very human for us,
Mm-hmm.
think how many times have we seen, and I just need everybody like to be honest for a second. How many times have we seen someone sick and had that sick but real sort of response? If this person would have taken care of themselves a little bit better, this wouldn't be
Mm-hmm.
happening. Okay, that's a
Mm.
very real thing that happens to human beings. Okay, how about this one? I'm involved in ministry. So are you. How about when we see people in church whose kids are messing up, they're not behaving, we're like, if their parents would have been at home, especially this is particularly applicable to women, if the mother would have stayed at home
Mm-hmm.
with the children like that wouldn't be happening.
Yeah.
Right? We make these judgments like Job's friends, like we could have done something to actually change the course of history. Now, there are consequences for actions, but in reality, we don't see this one-to-one sort of give take, this yin yang in the
Mm.
cosmos. That's just not how things work. It doesn't line up biblically with what we see either in Proverbs, Deuteronomy, or the Torah, or the book of Job, in my opinion. And it doesn't line up with our human experience. Thanks for
Mm.
putting up with a long-winded answer.
No, that's really good. And I love that you gave those harsh but real life examples because that's very convicting. Because honestly, when we do things like that and think things like that, we're being like Job's friends.
Yeah.
If you
Exactly
think
right.
of it, like
That's
it's
exactly right.
and it's exactly what the book is telling us not to be like. And so that's I'm really glad you gave those examples.
I mean, years ago, like, and I've shared this with Carla before, like at my church, we finally did a series on the Book of Job. And one of the things that, was subtly that we were trying to really hint at in the end was we probably have more in common with Job's friends
Yeah.
than we actually have in common with Job. That the reaction from his friends and the words and the wisdom that they were giving is more of a reflection of how we often think about how God works and how the world works and how suffering and pain works, and that it was meant to be a very sobering kind of picture back to us, a reflection back of like, are we not doing the same things? Are we not saying and thinking and believing the same kind of things? And like you said, Dominic, at the end, that like we're supposed to keep in mind in the end that Job didn't do anything wrong, and that the friends are wrong, and yet somehow it's so easy just to forget that simple fact that we ironically are probably agreeing in our just
Hmm.
our everyday lives with how Job's friends are seeing the situation,
Well, we
and
default to it. We
yeah, we
default
default
Yeah.
to
to it.
this. And one of the things that the book of Job teaches us is that we can't judge people exclusively based on their circumstances, though circumstances sometimes are real effects of what's going on, but we can't judge people exclusively based on their circumstances because of the next point that Job teaches us, which is all about our human finitude. We're finite beings. So when we judge people
Hmm.
based upon their circumstances, we're pretending to be infinite, which is one of the main things Job is teaching against. We are not
Yeah.
God. What are the whirlwind speeches? The whirlwind speeches seem to demonstrate that as well.
Yeah.
That's so
Well,
great, guys.
we're dust and ashes in the end.
Hmm. Yeah. That's so good. Okay, awesome. Well, let's go ahead and wrap up this episode. I think we covered a lot here and all the points that you guys made. I think it just needs to sit with all the listeners for a bit. So real quick before we close, will you share, Dr. Hernandez, just about a couple of those resources that you mentioned at the beginning, some of the books and things that you've written so that our listeners can dive into those, or if you have a website that they can gain access to your materials?
Sure. Well, the initial book that I made reference to is called "The Prosperity of the Wicked." It's a book that it's my monograph that was published about 3 years ago.
Okay.
by Gorgias Press, and it goes through the first two rounds of speeches in the book of Job, and talks extensively about what's going on there in the Hebrew Bible, both in terms of language, philologically, how we should understand what's going on, theologically as well. But it does comparative work with the ancient Near Eastern documents that sound very similar. So maybe we'll talk about this at some point. But there were these other ancient Near Eastern documents that sounded very similar to Job, mostly Akkadian language, but not exclusively Akkadian language, Sumerian, some Egyptian stuff, and there were similarities in how these documents were not only written, but some of the language and imagery that they used to express the prosperity of people that they perceive to be wicked. And so this is a comparative work that goes through the first two rounds of speeches in the book of Job and discusses all of those issues. So that's the monograph. That has been translated into Spanish. It's called La Prosperidad del Impío, if you have anybody that
Awesome.
is interested in reading that in Spanish. I also did a translation on the book of the book of Job, so my own translation, very sort of wooden translation with about 900 notes, that is
Wow.
in the form of a comic book. It was published by Glossa House, and so that is that's intended to be a language resource. So it has comics with the Hebrew text up top, then it has the Hebrew, then it has my translation at the bottom with notes to about 900 books, 900 notes in an appendix. But I'm also very
Wow.
proud of the introduction in that, yeah, where I try to set up what's happening in the book of Job. And then I wrote a book called Engaging the Old Testament: How to Read Biblical Narrative, Poetry, and Prophecy Well. And that book focuses mostly, there's one chapter exclusively on Job. But what I do in that book that I don't do in other books that I've written is that I spend time talking about hermeneutics and how
Mm.
sometimes we're taught, oh, this is wisdom that you got to read that way, or this is poetry, you have to read that way, sort of like pre-classify these books in the Bible and then read through that lens, when in actuality
Hmm.
there is no sort of appendix in the Bible that says these are the inspired genres. Read through these lenses, you know. So how do we perceive what biblical Hebrew poetry is doing, and then how do we use some of those observations to help us understand what's going on in books like Job and Proverbs, very very similar books in some senses, obviously. And then, sort of, in addition to that, not directly related to Job, but similar, is that I wrote a book called Proverbs: Pathways to Wisdom. It's like, what does that have to do with Job? I think that book is helpful in that it sets up how we're supposed to read Proverbs, which causes us less problems with how to read Job once we realize that Job's friends sound a lot like the book of Proverbs.
Hmm.
Mm.
Wow. Those are great resources. As you're talking about them,
Thank
I'm thinking,
you.
gosh, I want to check out that one and that one. So we'll make sure that we
I
link
have
those.
two of those already.
Do you? Okay, good.
Thank you for the
Well, we'll make sure
support.
we put links down so people can
Yeah.
access those, because those will be huge resources for our listeners to dive into.
Geez, Carla, I didn't even mention my website, so
Oh yeah, please do.
domshernandez.com.
Please do.
Yeah,
What,
so
say
I'm
it
at
one more time.
domshernandez.com. Sorry
Okay.
if I interrupted you again.
No, it's all good.
domshernandez.com. And also, I'm on, like, omnipresent on all of the social media platforms at Dr. Dominic. If you just type in Dr. Dominic or Dr. Dominic or something like this, it's normally some variation of that. And I'd be happy to interact. I interact on social media all of the time with people that contact me there. So be happy to interact with anyone that
Okay,
contacts me
great.
through social media.
Awesome. Well, we'll put all those links in the podcast description below. So listeners, you guys can engage with him there. And then we've got one final fun question. We always like to end with a little bit of a fun question. So tell us what your favorite thing to do is on a day off.
So this depends. Okay, so if it's a day, no, this is kind of all right. So I'm not trying to nuance this too much, like typical scholars, where they want to know. You say, "What color is that? Is that?" You're like, "Well, it depends on what you mean by red." Like, I'm not trying to do
Yeah.
that, but it does depend. Like, ideally, I would love to spend a day dancing, listening and dancing to salsa music with my wife. That
Oh, that's so
is
fun.
a day of fun for me and my wife. But the issue is that, we have to have days off on the same day, and then we
Sure.
have to get someone to watch the kids. And so that happens, with relative infrequence, though you're welcome to pray it happens more frequently. And no, really. Now, these days, what I most love to do is exercise a lot. And what I
Mm,
mean by a lot, I'm 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 45, so I'm not, in the I'm not in my taking advantage of my youthful years anymore. But I recently went through an Achilles tendon tear, and I promised myself after that anytime I had the opportunity to work out, be mobile, I was gonna do it, and for the past couple of months, that's what I've been doing, and I've enjoyed it way more in my older age than I did when
mhm.
I was younger and more athletic.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I tend to work out about 5 to 6 days a week, and I feel so much better when I do
Absolutely, yeah,
versus when I don't. And it's like you don't feel the benefits of it as much when you're younger, but as you start to get a little bit older, your body feels it and you just feel better when you do it. So I feel
absolutely.
you on that one for sure.
Makes me happy.
Awesome. Yes, it does. It does. Well, great. Well, thank you guys for joining us today. Thank you, listeners, for taking the time out of your busy day and listening. We hope that you enjoyed this content, and we hope that you will join us again next time as we get more of your questions on the book of Job answered. Make sure you like, share, subscribe, leave us a review, and we will see you right back here next time. If you're enjoying the Ask a Scholar podcast, click follow on your podcast listening app to subscribe. Want to help further our mission? Consider becoming a monthly partner at awkng.com and help us make an impact in the lives of others all around the world as we work to make biblical understanding accessible to all with no exceptions. Join us next time as we get more of your Bible questions answered. And don't forget to visit awkng.com to engage in all our biblical resources that we offer.